Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. Darren, great to be back with you in the Liminal Phrames chair. Sometimes I think my Liminal Phrames chair could be just a wee bit more comfortable, but I also don't want to get too comfortable, if you know what I mean. Really excited about our episode today. A lot of interesting territory to cover as usual. But before we dive into that territory, I want to start by a check-in, see how you're doing, how your week has been going, and then we'll go from there. So, Darren, fill me in. How are things?
Things are great. Things are engaging. Things are exciting. Things are all of the above. Tends to be the case these days. And we did an even longer catch-up than usual before we started recording tonight, just because there's so much to get to, both in terms of what's happening in the world, what's happening in the UFO space, what's happening in the intersecting consciousness space, and also what's happening personally. So I, as I've said before, kind of have this charmed life where I get to have some of these really deep conversations along these topics, much more so than the average person. And when I sometimes pause and reflect on the kinds of conversations that are happening, it really is amazing. And it's amazing to me that I am processing life and experiencing life and parsing life so differently than I would have even a few years ago. So this feels somehow all wrapped up in this sort of metaphysical evolution that's happening as we speak, and that will dovetail with some of the things we're going to be talking about tonight, where we go from the nuts and bolts into the very metaphysical. But that's my end. What about for you? How have things been for you recently?
Yeah, it's been kind of a crazy energy, to be honest. I am about to be on vacation in a couple of days, so I'm very good about that. But if anyone in the working world has planned a vacation and you're getting ready for that vacation, you know what it can feel like to be at your job, trying to get everything in order, making sure that all the ducks are in a row, as much stuff as you can get covered is covered so that you can enjoy the vacation that you plan. So that's where I'm at right now. The energy is a little bit hectic and frantic, just trying to get everything covered as much as I possibly can, but also really looking forward to a time of rest and relaxation, time spent with my family. We're going to be exploring parts of the U.S. that we've not been to before, beautiful natural parks. So really excited to do that, but just got to get over this last little hump. So all that said, great catching up. We've got a good show ahead of us here. We've got some territory that we really want to explore that we think, as we have felt into the moment that we're in, it really covers the landscape, I think, quite well. And we want to begin with a little bit of I'll say kind of a thought exercise. I want people, our listeners, to think back to what it felt like when they started getting into the UFO topic. And for those of you who've listened to our show for a long time, you've probably been in this space for quite some time, maybe longer than I have, which would be no surprise to me. But let's go back to 2017 when the article from the New York Times was published and the excitement really started to build. To the Stars Academy was launched. We learned about a guy named Lou Elizondo and a man named Chris Mellon, and they started talking about what they knew. We had some videos that were released. There was a tremendous amount of energy in the community that really kind of started a social media buzz. And so much so that in the Twitter space, which back when it was called Twitter, the hashtag UFO Twitter started to really coalesce. And people would use that as a way to find news and also to begin to form community. And there was a sense that we were really heading somewhere with this information and in a way that we maybe hadn't before. Those of you who've been in this topic for decades, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've experienced some of those headwinds in your journey, but this time seemed maybe a little bit different. Maybe we were actually going to get somewhere with this movement. We had additional figures step forward, like Gary Nolan, who brought in his scientific background to the conversation. More recently than that, we had whistleblower David Rush. And then just this year, we had Jake Bartle with Skywatcher and Matthew Brown. So we've had a lot of moments over the last several years where clarity has felt really close at hand, right, Darren? I think I felt that, at least. We've been really close to some interesting developments. But just like Lucy in the football, it feels like we're not quite there. It keeps getting yanked out, and we're not able to kick that ball and get it across the goalposts. So that's our retrospective. And Darren, what do you think about that? When I brought up those bullet points, walk me through kind of your energy at that time and how you felt about how close this was to being able to get some real answers to UFO disclosure.
Yeah, well, the first feeling I have is one of nostalgia when I think back to those moments. Even just before we started recording, you brought up TTSA and everything that happened with Tom DeLonge. Thinking back to that, when we had these people from the air defense industry being pulled together by Tom DeLonge, knowing that he'd been briefed by generals and admirals and people with deep knowledge of these things, and this sense that they were choosing, at the time, a somewhat younger guy that was in touch with the younger crowd to supposedly help bring disclosure, help slowly make us all aware of these things that have been happening behind the scenes. And as you pointed out, many people since then, Elizondo, Grush, people like Matthew Brown more recently, as well as the Skywatcher thing. And one of the things I've also been reflecting on, and we touched on this in our personal conversation, is just how quickly the hype cycle resets these days. So we think about how it wasn't that long ago, and only a couple shows ago, where we were talking about Skywatcher, and the promise there was that we were going to see the people create disclosure for the people, by the people, basically. Was the notion we don't need to wait for government, we're going to produce it, and very quickly. And the sense was certainly an imminent one, thinking back to Elizondo's book titled there. We had the sense that this could be within weeks, certainly within a month or two seemed realistic. Now, interestingly, since then, that's kind of crickets from that circle. I'm sure they're doing their work and collating data and all that. But the point I'm making is just how quickly we can go from one element topically to another. And same thing with Matthew Brown. That was a major moment historically. We had been receiving some hype that it was coming. Then we had him saying kind of allegorically and metaphorically some interesting things about being in a matrix, this not being real, this being carefully controlled. He also implied not just NHI involvement and this reference to humanity being kind of a resource, but he also made reference to what seems like a breakaway civilization or a technological elite that have so eclipsed us that they're basically living in a different world and basically carefully crafting a false world for the rest of us. So that was a major moment. But even then, we're past that now. And then most recently, of course, we have one element that's been part of that lore that's been reintroduced, but with a new wrinkle involved, and that's the Tic Tac, which, if you think about it, going back to Leslie and Ralph's article that kicked off a lot of the modern UFO phenomenon in terms of UFO Twitter and the community that you referenced, a lot of it arose from that incident and people like Chris Mellon working to get that footage out into the public. And that kicked off this whole movement. And now we have new questions around what actually happened there, what was actually involved. Was this our closest yet evidence of seeing UAP in terms of alien technology being paraded in front of us? Or was this actually pointing to something different that is only tangentially connected to aliens because it's actually reverse engineered human technology? This is, of course, referencing what's recently come up with this notion that this could be Lockheed Martin technology. So we're going to get into that and all the implications. But generally speaking, Nathan, I would just say that I have feelings of nostalgia, and to some degree, it almost feels a bit schizophrenic to jump around and think about all those different elements and to try to have an overarching enough perspective to keep it all in mind as we reflect on where we've come from and where we're going.
Yeah, I love that you use that word nostalgia. That's exactly how I feel about it as well. And in some ways, looking back, it seems kind of quaint, right? Oh, it was really sweet this time where we had these really credentialed people who were hitting the circuit, going on everybody's podcast, willing to talk about what they knew. It felt electric, that energy, like that something was really going to happen. And recently, that energy has shifted 100% in some big ways. I can think too that we earlier in the year when Trump, was becoming the president again, there was a lot of energy around him being incredibly transparent, and maybe he was going to finally disclose. And, there was this tremendous amount of rhetoric around the JFK files and the RFK and the MLK and all the greatest conspiracies in the U.S. government. The UAP caucus, felt like they had the ear of the president and they were going to get some secrets as well. all this stuff felt like, oh, the dam was going to break. And subsequently, over the many last few months, we've learned that not a lot of the secrets have really broken. And in some ways, the official narrative that we've been told has become at odds with what the facts seem to say. And I know that does sound conspiratorial, but I think there are some pretty clear instances here where there has been some doublespeak from the administration that doesn't align with the rhetoric they espoused before they took the office. And I can think of specific examples. Some agency heads come to mind who were all about talking about the secrets. And when they became the heads of those agencies, they've been awfully quiet and have been very guarded in what they've been willing to share. So you have that shift that has taken place. You've had a period where a kind of clarity felt like was on the horizon, and the energy in the recent weeks has shifted to one of, I would say, kind of confusion and uncertainty. There's been a lot of conflicting or challenging information emerging from within the UFO conversation from sources that traditionally have been reliable, and now I think some people are questioning the reliability of those sources. It's causing a little bit of cognitive dissonance. You know, my favorite pundit, who I used to trust implicitly, said something that now I just don't know if I really agree with, and how do I make sense of that? So you can see that the picture I'm trying to paint, hopefully, is one where the landscape is changing. It is quite confusing. There's a bit of a cloud around us, a cloud of uncertainty. We've got other kind of sound bites that feed into that as well. You know, Darren, I'm thinking of things like the Nazca mummies and the Lubosphere. We've had, the Epstein situation recently, and, all of this stuff that seems to be just frustrating. It's the best way I can describe it. I'm not getting clarity. We're getting just more and more confusion and frustration. And I think disillusionment may be another word that might come to mind there. So in the midst of that, right, we're in the midst of that picture, something recent was revealed in a podcast with Bryce Zabel and Ross Coulthart on their Need to Know podcast. And we want to spend some time talking about that. So Darren, I wonder if you could really set the stage, and maybe before you do, kind of reflect a little bit on what I just talked about with that fog of uncertainty. What are we getting into here? How did that information hit you when we talk about that podcast?
Yeah, well, one thing that always occurs to me first and foremost when I think about these matters is that a lot of how people deal with these issues, try to integrate them and make sense of them, depends upon the possibility space that they're already entertaining, that is sometimes consciously chosen and sometimes not consciously chosen. In other words, sometimes they're consciously aware of which kinds of data they're open to and which ones they're not, and sometimes they're not even tracking that. And so for those people who have all along been suspicious that this might be black tech that is really sophisticated, then of course they might feel vindicated and feel all the more that they should go in that direction. I think there are some people feeling like all their eggs were in the basket of events like the Tic Tac in order to demonstrate to their friends and colleagues and eventually the world that aliens are really here. Some of those people are feeling a little bit nervous and uncomfortable, frankly, with this latest revelation because they're not so far along in their grokking of this and their integrating of this to believe for sure that it's true. And so some people are going, what if we've been deceived all along or just misinterpreted the evidence? So it's really fascinating to watch how people make sense of this. And again, the acknowledged and unacknowledged aspects of their own thought process. And this is something you and I have championed many times, of course, on Liminal Phrames, is to be as conscious as you can be about your own process and your own distortions and how we can be aware of and work to clean those distortions. But that comes to mind that I see maybe 75% of the activity I see in the social community around UFOs is those distortions interacting with each other and creating feedback effects. And the actual data itself is a small subset within that. And not many people have the disposition and the history and the habituated constancy to understand how to deal with complex data and make sense of things, especially when something seems to take a flip, like what's happened with this most recent information. But I think for you and I, we are very capable and prepared to do this kind of deep analysis without being thrown off our mooring because of it. So let's describe specifically what was revealed in that podcast with Bryce and Ross. I first want to say that what was revealed wasn't necessarily new. We had been hearing these kinds of notions before. We want to make that point. But it was being made by someone who is seen as the most mainstream journalist perhaps we have in this field. We can't get the typical mainstream journalist to pay attention. So someone like Ross is the closest thing we have coming from mainstream media and now trying to bring attention to this on News Nation, for instance. And we can also get into how Bryce Sable had been talking about this beforehand, right? Had been kind of bleeding little elements here and there that you're not going to believe what Ross said is throw me for a loop. And so that in itself creates an interesting psychological environment before the information even comes out. But the statement that Ross made was that he said that he could say categorically, quote, the Tic Tac is Lockheed Martin technology. And then, of course, when you're watching it live, or if you watched it on video, you see Bryce push back from the table and say, whoa, because it's this big revelation. Now, I think it's interesting because, as I just said, this is actually not new. It's new that someone maybe of the caliber or the pedigree of Ross is saying it, but we've heard other people saying this. In fact, you and I recently, in a previous episode, talked about Stephen Greer and what he discussed on American Alchemy. That's one of the elements he brought up, is that some of these craft that are being observed actually are reverse engineered tech, and that this is actually all part of some scheme to create this fake alien invasion, basically, this false flag. So this, of course, brings all that back into the picture. And I saw a lot of people in our community saying, aha, Stephen Greer's right all along. And then you see almost people re-examining their commitments and their attachments to different people and authorities. One of the things we're going to talk about tonight is ascribing to authority and how you identify authorities and how that gets challenged, and even how you see people switching teams as things unfold. But that was the big revelation. And again, we're going to get into in a little bit all of the performance characteristics. I want to break those down again, because beyond this being potentially U.S. technology that we assume has been reverse engineered, the implications not just for jet technology and propulsion systems with aircraft, but the implications for all sectors of our economy and our civilization are incredibly consequential. It's a massive, massive revelation if this is true. And so that's what I come away with, and that's what we've been wrestling with as a community. But you tell me, what was it like for you when you first heard that claim being made by Ross?
When I heard that on the Need to Know podcast, I mean, first of all, I met Bryce Sable. He's awesome. And when he posted about the conversation they were going to have a couple of days before they actually aired it, I was very, very intrigued. He totally set the stage. He, like a good salesman, he really got me interested in what was going to be said. And so as soon as I could tune into that segment of the show, I made sure to do that. And as I was listening to Ross talk about that, he could categorically, confirm that the Tic Tac was Lockheed Martin technology. Bryce's reaction was visceral. It was really fun to watch, kind of him process that information in real time. All that said, I think, as you pointed out, we've had rumors that this has been Lockheed Martin technology for quite some time. I think at least a couple of years, if not more, that has been swirling around as a possibility. And there are good arguments that people have levied to say there's no way it could possibly be Lockheed Martin technology. And the reasons for that they provide are the things you'd expect, right? If we had the technology, why haven't we used it? If we had the technology, why would we do it against our own forces? If we had the technology, why do we let China get away with whatever they're doing here, there, whatever? Why don't we already have free energy? Yada yada yada. If they had the technology, if there's no way humans could be in it because it would turn them into jam. If those G forces, a lot of conventional rationale applied to why it couldn't possibly be ours. I personally think it's just a lack of imagination. I think I can think of a lot of reasons why it could very well be ours, or the true picture of what the technology is could be a little bit muddier than that. As you pointed out, it could be reverse engineered technology from NHI. there's also a long history of the Tic Tac object being in the lore. We've got stories going back many, many decades of Tic Tacs being seen in the sky, described differently as, butane tanks, for example. So you can't tell me that Lockheed Martin's had a flying butane tank for many, many, many decades. Maybe they have. I leave a lot of possibility space open here, but just pointing out that it could be murkier than it may seem, even though Ross does provide that great degree of certainty. So it was a fascinating conversation, and I think one that really needed to be had, quite frankly, because it had a lot of other elements that we're going to dive into that are really worth exploring, related to the geopolitical landscape and breakaway civilization and all of these things that I think make the picture of disclosure far more complicated than we might want it to be. And so that's certainly my initial reaction, but I wanted you to walk us through, you were kind of mentioning to me the implications of the Tic Tac technology. That's a tongue twister. I'd like you to walk us through those implications. What would having that kind of technology mean? What are some of the things that would naturally follow along if we were in possession of such technology and it wasn't just NHI flying that around?
Yeah, that's definitely worth getting into. And I think when we think about the implications, it will bring clarity to maybe some of the comments that Matthew Brown has made in terms of categorically how different the technological level would be for some elite group of humanity. And as I say, the implications stretch far and wide. But before we go there, let's first recap what actually happened with the Tic Tac in 2004, refresh people's memory, and to just make clear how amazing and game-changing and paradigm-shattering the demonstration of the technology was. So for those of you who might remember, and those of you maybe who have foggier memory, the Tic Tac was an anomalous craft observed during the 2004 USS Nimitz incident off the coast of Southern California, and it exhibited flight characteristics that defy known aerospace engineering and physics as we currently understand them. We keep hearing this reference to breaking the laws of physics. Of course, what we mean by that is our understanding of the laws of physics. And this, by the way, is how consequential this is, because even people like Eric Weinstein have been recently riffing on this on social media. He is growing ever more suspicious that there might have been breakthroughs that happened in the middle part of the 20th century, even to the point where he's actually wondering if the UFO phenomenon is partly a ruse set up to disguise the fact that human beings and elements of human elites have made these massive breakthroughs, and that furthermore, there might have been this deliberate deception and leaving breadcrumbs to leave conventional scientists in physics down the wrong path, for instance, following string theory. And he talks about how uneventful the history of physics has been since the middle part of the 20th century, almost conspicuously is what he's suggesting there. That makes him think that perhaps not only is there an elite that's made these breakthroughs, but they are basically managing the rest of society and our understanding of what even is possible, very much in line with what Matthew Brown was saying. Now, these characteristics were reported by multiple credible military witnesses, including trained pilots and radar operators, and partially corroborated by radar and infrared footage. So that was one of the really compelling aspects, is we had testimony from these star pilots that everyone trusted and saw them as being above reproach, but it was also supported by additional corroborating radar and infrared footage as well. So let's talk about the actual characteristics themselves. First thing is sudden extreme acceleration. So the object was observed to accelerate from a hover or slow speed to hypersonic velocity instantaneously without a visible means of propulsion. And as I go through each of these, because many of us have heard these before, but think about it in terms of the implications if human beings had this technology. Now, Commander David Fravor, who was one of those pilots piloting an F-18, described the Tic Tac as disappearing like a bullet, quote unquote, or a ping pong ball bouncing off walls. That describes the kind of way it would, in an erratic manner, move one place and then suddenly be in another place. And even what you would expect in terms of rounding out movements, if you're responding to the usual forces of gravity, were not apparent. The second characteristic is no observable propulsion or control surfaces. So the Tic Tac had no wings, rotors, exhaust, or control surfaces. And just to clarify, we know of no human-made technology that can fly, that can stay aloft without those elements. There was also no heat signature or sonic boom detected, despite its rapid acceleration. So whenever we see this military footage, even night footage, you can always see the objects because they're warm against the environment. That's how they show up. That's how they're being tracked. But there was no heat signature here, even with all the bizarre performance characteristics. Next one is transmedium travel. The object was tracked descending from 80,000 feet to sea level in less than a second. So basically, low Earth orbit to just above the sea in less than a second. Imagine what's possible if human beings have that technology. It hovered over or just under the ocean surface and may have interacted with a larger submerged object. This has been rumored based on what was seen and the churning of the water. And the next one we want to identify is instantaneous directional changes, which I kind of hinted at earlier. So the craft displayed non-inertial motion, including turns at high speed that would subject any occupants to lethal G-forces. And this is a key element here, because this tells us that something bizarre is going on here, because if a human pilot was subjected to those kinds of right-angle turns, it would turn them to mush, basically. So either they're being operated remotely, which is possible, or the people inside were somehow cushioned from that. And this gives rise to notions of there basically being supported in a space-time bubble of its own, basically. These maneuvers occurred without slowing down or arcing, as I just mentioned, as aircraft typically must demonstrate. There's also hovering and station keeping. It was capable of perfectly stable hovering, even in high winds with no drift or wobble, which again does away with skeptics who like to say this might have been a balloon. It also seemed responsive to human presence, appeared to be aware of and responsive to the fighter jets, at one point mirroring Fravre's maneuver, then rapidly departing. And there's also advanced jamming or spoofing, where some of the radar operators reported unusual jamming effects or intermittent radar returns. So the implications are massive. These flight characteristics suggest that the Tic Tac was not constrained by aerodynamic or gravitational limitations. If the object was real and not an instrumentation artifact, it would imply propulsion and control systems that either exploit principles not yet understood by mainstream physics, for example, the manipulation of inertia, gravity, and space-time itself, or represent extreme advancements in material science, energy systems, and AI-driven control mechanisms. So, the implications are vast, they stretch far and wide, and while we get some people already infighting around which camp they prefer here, I think either option we should take pause and think about the implications. Because as you and I talked about privately, this may not be as black and white as, is it alien tech or is it human tech? Not only is there the possibility of reverse engineering recovered tech, but there's also the possibility of a cooperatively operated vehicle, and this speaks to one of those characters you mentioned in our historical overview, David Grush, talking about historical accords between NHI and human governments. So when I go through that list of all the characteristics and you think about the implications if that is somehow in the hands of some human beings, what comes to mind for you, Nathan?
Well, I'm sure it's going to be used in peaceful, loving ways possible. Yeah, it does open up, I don't want to say a limitless possibility space, but a lot of possibilities for exploitation of a variety of fields, right? So you've got the ability to use that technology in a warfare capacity. You've got that to be used in a transportation capacity. But now we're talking about potential for space-time metric engineering, which we've heard that used before, or that term used before. And when we get into this realm of engineering space-time and time travel, a whole lot of things start getting on the table really, really fast. And, imagine human beings having the capability to do that. Imagine what they might do with that if something horrible takes place and they want to go back in time to try to change the past and realize that maybe that's not how it works, or maybe multiple, parallel timelines become a part of the equation. We've heard rumors in the past as well of sort of a managed reality, so that the mastery of this type of technology could provide people who wield it the ability to manage reality in the world and manage our ability to truly understand what is taking place, so that our sense of objectivity is really challenged. Our sense of right and wrong, of true and false. These are things that are essentially charades for all of us to be oblivious to, and it's almost like we're living in a kind of Truman Show. And that begs the question: well, who behind the camera? Who's really behind the show? And what is their agenda? What is our part in that story? Who's it really at war here? Is it the traditional geopolitical forces that are battling one another? Or is there something else at play, something deeper at play? A whole lot of things come to mind from just that one revelation. And like you said, with your mention of Eric Weinstein, there's been this sense recently that this reexamination of that development at that gravity conference that took place in the mid 20th century, where they were pursuing breakthroughs in gravity engineering. And there's a growing sense in which a lot of that physics may have been not a dead end at all, but just sort of squirreled away into a black budget program. And our physicists were led on a goose chase on another branch of physics that really doesn't have the kind of fruitful results that this gravity-based physics would reveal. And therefore we're at a place now where we're kind of chasing our tails. We're not making any breakthroughs, and we're not able to proceed with the true physics that we'd be able to pursue. And we've even heard stories that the government has classified certain branches of physics and mathematics, like that they'll just shut it down. I don't know how they can do that. That's pretty wild. So if they can do that, maybe that does or add to this notion that there is within elements of our government the ability to control reality, manage reality in ways that are beyond conventional ways of manipulation. So a whole lot of things come to mind there, and it's a bit head spinning, to be honest with you.
Absolutely. And I'm sure the audience is feeling the same thing right now. And I want to describe some more of the implications in terms of other segments of our society and how they would be impacted by these kinds of technologies. And then after that, I want to come back to Bryce and Ross's conversation, because they also discussed the drone, something we've discussed on different podcast episodes. And what was implied there was also incredibly consequential, and that has nothing to do with the Tic Tac, other than it's another example of technology that perhaps is suggesting things on the surface are not at all representing what's going on at a deeper level. But let's think about some of the breakthroughs and how they would apply to different segments of our society. And by the way, I just want to encourage people, if they want to learn more about the potential breakthroughs that happened in the middle part of the 20th century as zero point was being pursued and anti-gravity technology, we would, I think, both recommend Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point, is a great book that gets into this. I've had conversations with Nick privately about these things, and he has a sense that some of these aerospace executives are aware of some of this. And there's hints, I think, that this indeed has happened even from that sector. But let's talk about some of the breakthroughs in terms of how this would apply. So let's take, for instance, the breakthrough in field-based or zero-point energy, which I just identified, and what that would mean when you have no visible propulsion or fuel. So you might be tapping into the zero-point field itself. So you're tapping basically into empty space, which we now understand is not empty at all. It's teeming with potential energy. So the notion here is that you're able to basically game that. You're able to pull from that field and generate all the power you would ever need. So what would this mean in addition to cool craft that jump around? It would mean global access to clean, limitless energy. And this would end all dependence on fossil fuels. As you and I both know, we still live in a petroleum-based economy. That is a rug that gets pulled out from underneath all of us if this is true. So zero-point energy is not just about how you propulse these aircraft. It's also about how you energize and power anything. And the whole point here is that this would be limitless. It would be free. And it would also, very importantly, have major implications for the climate change problems we're facing as well. So this enables decentralized energy infrastructure, which right there might give us hints as to why this would not want to be disclosed, because there are certainly parties that want to keep their monopoly and their dominance over the current system. And it collapses traditional energy markets, as I'm just saying. And this also will destabilize the geopolitical situation as well, which is very much tied to oil and gas. Then we think about transportation and space travel implications. So if the breakthrough involves inertia-defying propulsion and trans-medium travel, meaning not just air and sea, but also space, because again, the implication is these objects are in a space-time bubble, meaning they could go into the vacuum of space and operate just as easily as they can under the water or in the open air. So this would mean instant point-to-point travel across the globe, eliminates conventional airlines. Rapid space access enables orbital logistics, mining, and even Mars colonization. So we have Elon Musk and people talking about eventually getting to Mars. The notion here would be we actually, if this is true, what's being alleged here, would have had the technology to do this in the middle part to the late part of the 20th century. And that, of course, raises the possibility that it's already happening. And this, of course, lends us into that category of the things that are considered more outlandish, the more outlier elements, such as the secret space program. This would transform civilian travel, logistics, and supply chains beyond recognition. So we all saw how supply chains kind of went to hell during COVID. When everything kind of shut down, we realized how interconnected these systems are. All of that would change overnight if this kind of technology exists. Then there's the physics and scientific paradigm shifts. So if the breakthrough includes the manipulation of space-time, as we've been discussing, gravity or inertial mass, then this overturns Newtonian and relativistic limits on acceleration and motion. This sparks a revolution in theoretical physics, which ties in with what we were saying about Eric Weinstein, potentially unifying quantum and gravity. And it introduces new scientific constants potentially, or dimensions even, into standard models. So in Congress, we have people saying, I agree with David Grush, I think these beings might be interdimensional. Well, the implication here is this technology might allow us to traverse between those dimensions even potentially. Then there's the medical and biological applications. Is everybody holding onto their heads as they're spinning here? If the breakthrough involves inertial dampening and field effects around the craft, again, I'm talking about the bubble around the craft, then this would enable trauma-stabilizing environments for battlefield or ER use. We could have field manipulation that would lead to non-invasive healing or regenerative tech for human healing. And this would involve insights into biofield interaction, which may revolutionize diagnosis and therapy. I also pointed to the climate implications. So think about field manipulation and non-polluting energy generation. This provides energy-intensive geoengineering solutions without ecological side effects. Field-based tech could be used to detoxify air, water, and soil rapidly, and we could actually reverse some of the effects of climate change. And this would support planetary-scale restoration, including potential terraforming tools. Then we think about the material science pointed to earlier. So if the breakthrough involves the use of exotic metamaterials, which you certainly have heard discussed, going back over our arc of history there, TTSA was talking a lot about that, examination and potentially even new technologies that would emerge from this metamaterial analysis. So the use of exotic metamaterials and structural resilience under extreme forces, what would that open up? This enables ultralight, hyper-strong materials for all industries. So we sometimes hear about stealth technology or even transistors and whatnot, and Velcro even, some people have talked about as arising from recovered tech that happened. And Colonel Corso kind of hinted at those kinds of things, that we're actually recovering alien tech, and this was doled out to different U.S. industries. Well, what happens here if we have ultralight, hyperstrong materials and we could dole that out to all these different industries? This would allow atomically precise fabrication akin to speculative nanotech. So we've had this discussion being had, right, that we recognize that, and again, Tom DeLonge spoke to this in his heyday, that it's atomic level construction. So it's not just what's involved in the material, but atom by atom, you construct it in such a way that you create this matrix that is incredibly strong and lightweight and those kinds of things. We think about what was recovered reportedly at Roswell, material that you could pick up super light, you could crunch it up, let go, and it goes back into its original shape, those kinds of things. And this even opens the door to programmable matter, or shape-shifting devices would be an implication of this kind of technology. Think about a couple more here. Communication and computation implications. So if the breakthrough involves possible space-time or quantum-based information transfer, then this supports instant or non-local communication, bypassing light speed limits. This could yield consciousness-linked interfaces without traditional input devices. We think about slide 9 there, comes into play here. And this sparks post-quantum computing architectures tied to the craft's control mechanisms. So, geopolitics and global power dynamics. If the breakthrough involves absolute mobility, stealth, and tactical superiority, then this creates unassailable military advantage for any group that has this technology. This shifts global power away from conventional state militaries towards technocratic elites, which is exactly what has been rumored in some segments of the lore. And, as we already hinted at, this raises the threat of a classified breakaway civilization. So, Nathan, that's a lot. If your head wasn't already spinning, it definitely is now. You might need to pick it up off the floor, put it back on your shoulders. What comes to mind in light of all those implications?
Yeesh. That's all I gotta say. That's a lot. That is a lot. It's quite destabilizing, I think, is the bottom line. If this tech were available and made available to the world, it would transform human civilization top to bottom, no doubt. So it begs the question, why hasn't that happened? And this has been, like you said, we both said, a rumor for quite some time that we may have had possession of this type of technology. So why haven't we utilized the technology in very public ways, like we have with our stealth fighters and other things? Why would we keep this technology so close to the chest? I don't know. I don't know other than to say the power of holding it maybe outweighs the power of giving it away. And so that kind of gets you thinking about, I think definitely chasing that breakaway concept is a very real possibility. And I want to say too, while you're talking about it, and I haven't heard this mentioned before in the conversation since Ross brought it up, but we could be seeing a Lockheed piece of technology from the future. So, if we are talking about space-time engineering, maybe it's not a past developed Tic Tac, but a future developed Tic Tac that happened to appear during the Nimitz workup. Maybe that's why it happened to know where the cap point was. Maybe that's, there's a lot of interesting things that come to mind from just these implications. So all that said, you and I both know that the United States has not been the only player in this game of potential reverse engineered non-human intelligent technologies. And Ross and Bryce spent a lot of time talking about that very subject. Who has the technology, who's developing it, who's ahead, who's behind. There's another type of Cold War essentially taking place, at least rumored to be taking place in the world amongst these superpowers who have apparently crash retrievals, reverse engineering programs, and they've developed technologies to exploit those craft, exploit those reverse engineered materials. So who's in the lead there? What are we thinking about that? They definitely brought up China as the big player. That has huge implications for the current world order, and also makes us think back to the drone incursion issue and the balloon thing that happened in 2023. There's a whole lot of stuff we could talk about here about the balance of power and this secret arms race. So what were your thoughts as they explored this facet of the conversation?
One thing that occurs to me, even as I hear you reflect on some of that there, is that what's interesting and I think compelling and supports the fact that this is part of the lore because it does point to something real, is that as these new threads emerge, they actually help tie together elements that have kind of been hanging outside the suitcase, if you will, in terms of our understanding of what's going on. Because, of course, one of the revelations that David Grush, one of these historical figures we referenced, talked about was that there's been an ongoing Cold War, basically to reverse engineer, race to reverse engineer this tech for the very reasons we pointed to. And people like Jay Stratton have said this, right? That whoever gets this tech first controls the world. It's an endgame, basically. And as you pointed to, this also had implications not just for the Tic Tac technology, but even more recent events, for instance, the drone incursions, which we've referenced a couple different times on our podcast. So definitely Ross brought up some really consequential elements there. It does dovetail with some of the things I said, I think, in our most recent discussion of the drones. And that being namely that while there are multiple things in play here, and we'll identify each of those, first and foremost, a significant contingent of these drones, apparently according to the information Ross is being provided with, are Chinese in origin. So just like we went through all the implications, the game-changing implications of this technology, think not just about what it means if China has the technology to be operating these drones in the ways they were operating that seemed to defy our understanding of how things work, but also think about what that means geopolitically if our primary rival or one of our primary rivals is so brazenly acting in that way. What does that suggest in terms of not just how they feel confident about their particular position, but also maybe how the U.S. is not comfortable at all discussing this publicly, because it might even point to a sea change in terms of the geopolitical kind of arrangement. And that's something that Ross actually identified. He said basically that there's this understanding within some aspects of the military, again, more elite elements, not necessarily your average person in the Corps or whatever, that we have not only been caught up to in terms of where we are, but we may have even been surpassed in the development. And you and I have had conversations about this. And I think one of the things that arises here is that there's a certain complacency that arises with us having, quote unquote, won the Cold War, right? And even having defeated the Nazis before that. That can lull us into a certain overconfidence that free market forces and America always comes out on top. And many people, even in some circles, would say that that's a God-given right that things would work out that way. So much so that we may have been lulled into a kind of complacency that is such that we have not been tracking just how much progress some of these adversaries may have been making. Because if it's true that these drones were Chinese in origin, then let's think about the implications there, because we discussed this many times. The part that was kind of shocking was that these things, which were apparently not ours, were operating, and this is a term that gets used over and over again, with impunity over our most sensitive military sites. So that means that they could come not only into the continental U.S., but they could fly right up to and over our most sensitive military facilities, and there's nothing we could do about it. We couldn't shoot them down. We couldn't jam them using traditional drone technology and devices, and we often couldn't determine where they were coming from or where they were going to. There was also reports, as you and I discussed on previous podcasts, of shape-shifting, which we just referenced in terms of an implication of this technology that would come online if this really is in play, that was demonstrated and recognized. And sometimes things that look like planes but not quite right, almost like they're mimicking both the behavior and even the shape of planes. So this is so consequential because we think recently to what happened with that stealthy strike that was made by Ukraine against Russian forces. So for those maybe who don't remember, or just to refresh people's memory, within the last couple of months, Ukraine pulled off this pretty impressive chess move where they had hidden all these drones inside of a truck that was, carrying cargo into Russia. And once they got to a certain location, they lifted off the roof of that truck, the freight, and launched these drones very close to the nearby Russian airfields. And they basically bombed all of these Russian crafts. So something like a quarter of the Russian fleet was completely destroyed, not just temporarily, but destroyed altogether without ever having a chance to get airborne. So think about the implication here with what we're seeing happening over our own country. And not just here, but also it was happening in the UK, if you remember, over parts of continental Europe as well. that these drones could fly with impunity over these facilities. And the implication being when they wanted to, if they wanted to, they could take out massive aspects of our military that we as taxpayers spend trillions and trillions of dollars building up. And so overnight, before they even get a chance to get airborne, that could be destroyed. And so Ross even brought up the implication that what if in the future China makes some sort of plan to not only invade Taiwan and take back what they think is rightfully theirs, but also in tandem with that, takes out a bunch of our airfields and our equipment before we even have a chance to use them and respond. The possibility of that comes into play if all of this is true. And if this also ties into what we've been saying before, right, that if it's not just the US that has successfully reverse engineered some of this tech, therefore it's not just companies like Lockheed Martin that have this tech, but if Chinese companies have done it as well, then the implication is that they absolutely could have this drone technology. And that would mean that in some ways, people's worst case scenario is in play here. That not only do we have elements of the elite within our own country that have access to and possession of technology that could transform the world in really positive ways, but as you pointed to kind of humorously, is certainly not being used for that. But that in fact, even the current geopolitical situation is actually just a shell game. And deep states within both of these countries might have potentials that could change the geopolitical situation overnight. And this might have all snuck up on us because this has all been so secretive. So again, a lot more to grok there, Nathan, even beyond the implications of the Tic Tac technology potentially being our craft. So what comes to mind when you think about the geopolitical implications and even the near future in terms of Earth civilization?
Yeah, I'm reminded that I heard someone say that the Chinese tend to think in terms of centuries, whereas the United States really thinks in terms of administrations and maybe a decade at a time. So the implication being the U.S. is quite short-sighted, and the Chinese have a very long view of history and strategy and are playing a longer game. And hints at this notion that the U.S. after World War II, kind of coming out of that conflict on the winning side, really kind of patting itself on the back and thinking, well, the success, the secret sauce, the secret formula to winning conflict is just spending money in our military and getting more planes, more tanks, more soldiers, more weapons, better weapons, and keep that engine running. And we, of course, know the military-industrial complex that sort of spun out from that conflict as well, and how powerful they have become as a result of that mentality. Just keep developing better and better weapons platforms, selling those platforms to the government at sweetheart deal contract prices, and keep that formula, keep that process running as long as you possibly can, because it's great for business, great for shareholders. And there's a graphic I think I saw recently too, on my little video graphic, where they kind of do these column charts of like the number of aircraft that every country has. And it starts out with the small countries and the columns are really small. And as you pan out, basically the number of planes that the United States has in its Air Force dramatically dwarfs any other military power on the planet. And so you're thinking, well, it's just a numbers game. We've got more planes than anybody else, so therefore we're going to be the top dog. We're not going to be able to be toppled. We've got the power here. Well, now we have a situation where that power dynamic is potentially dramatically upturned, and the conventional way in which we thought we maintained our power is directly at risk here. It doesn't matter how many nuclear weapons we have. It doesn't matter how many airplanes we have. If this type of technology exists and if China is in possession of it, they can essentially do whatever they want to do in a very stealthy way without us being the wiser, and stop us from reacting before we have a chance to do so. So it's pretty dramatic. I think the reason why there could be several reasons why that the balance of power hasn't fully changed. And that's probably because, as Ross mentioned in the show as well, the U.S. does have advanced technology. And it's not that we're just, sitting around with nothing. The U.S. does have advanced technology, and there is a bit of a Cold War happening between the nations. And there's not really a sense in which we need to take this conflict beyond a simmer. It's certainly simmering, but do we really need to bring it up to a boil at this point? And I think that the sense is that maybe we don't. I think China is more than happy to let us continue getting bogged down with sort of these distractions like the war in the Ukraine and the conflict with Iran. And I mean that this distraction sense that it's just chewing up U.S. resources. I think China is more than happy to let us kind of spend money on those in those areas and not really, get involved, weakening us in the process. So a lot of things at play here with the overall dynamic. And it also speaks, Darren, to the sort of the propaganda aspect of things. And that's, what is the U.S. willing to say publicly about this reality, and how much, again, of reality is managed by the political class? How much do we really know about the true balance of power in the world? You certainly don't want to hear your politicians say, yeah, China can fly these drones wherever they want over the continental U.S., and we can't do damn thing to stop them. That's like, you don't want that soundbite on the news. But essentially, we've heard that exact soundbite from that 60 Minutes episode with those Air Force generals. We just didn't hear them attribute that explicitly to the Chinese. And this is really what we've been dancing around for years now. And that's that, could be adversarial technology. It could be some technology. We don't know whose it is. I really hope it's adversarial technology. I really hope it's alien technology, not adversarial. We've been dancing around this subject for quite some time, but I don't know how much longer that dance can truly go on before we have to come face to face with the facts. And I think maybe, Ross is alluding to a pretty near-term conflict that could kind of bring this out into the forefront. I don't know that. I just think it's just pure speculation there, but there's a lot at play that obviously changes the equation automatically.
Yeah, it is. It is mind-bending, absolutely, when you think about all the consequences, potentially all the implications. And before we move into some of the big picture questions around how we should navigate these kinds of complicated waters, let's first talk about this specific claim and where we land on it. So, for instance, you've got now Ross Coulthart coming alongside people like Stephen Greer claim that this is actually our tech. And of course, that raises additional questions around, so if it's our tech, what does that mean? What's potentially being set up here? One thing I will say is that Ross basically brought this up, but I've heard it in other circles too, that it feels like we're kind of sleepwalking towards an inevitable war with China. And that in itself is interesting to me, obviously problematic and concerning. And in light of the fact that we may have something like looking glass technology when we think about space-time engineering, because as you pointed out earlier, the implication of this is that time travel comes into the picture as well. Certainly seeing across the arc of time in a way that we can't imagine now, then it may be that this sense is that it's known that there will be a war with China. And so basically it's just preparing for that. Who knows how this actually works? Like you say, once you get there, could it be that the reason why this has been kept so secret is because they've learned somehow to splinter a different space-time where all of this actually is being operationalized and used and put to good use, or at least the use that is to their advantage in some other version of reality, an alternate Earth. That might be happening, and yet they've been able to keep it largely in the dark here. I also want to point out that you'll often hear this argument in terms of where we weigh the likelihood that this is actually Lockheed Martin tech, as is being alleged here. You'll have some people say there's no way, and the reason why there's no way is because every other incident in history, when we have cutting-edge technology, we end up using it within, a few years' time, basically, in some arena of war. Now, as I like to point out to people, we should learn from history, but history doesn't determine every eventuality. And things happen like they always have until they don't. And one circumstance, speaking of having enough imagination, which you talked about earlier, in terms of a poverty of imagination here, is that if you have a technology that is so game-changing, so paradigm-shattering, so on a different level altogether than anything that exists in the conventional frame, I could understand there that you would actually hold off because you recognize it's a new world if you introduce that technology. So up until now, when we've made those arguments about it always does end up being introduced, it's because that's always been incremental technology. But this is not incremental. This is an exponential leap with implications that stretch in every direction. So I want to bring that up. But let's think about who's in support, right? So in support of this notion is people like Greer. We have plenty of contrarians that point to the fact that what I just said, if we had this tech, we would have seen it being used already. We've got people like my friend Kevin Knuth, who have been making an argument in academia, breaking down those characteristics of the TICTAC and even giving considerations mathematically, really complex math, breaking down the energy requirements to basically power that kind of technology. And it's beyond anything we can conceive of. It's enough energy basically to power the world over multiple periods of time. And so again, the implication is if we had that, wouldn't we see it being used elsewhere? Therefore, the conclusion is it couldn't possibly be ours. But that, again, is kind of circular reasoning. And if what I just pointed to is true, either like a splintering of space-time or a recognition that this is so game-changing that it's kept under wraps for exactly those reasons, then potentially that could account for that. We've got people like David Fravor. You and I talked about this before we started recording, that testified before Congress as an expert witness that there's no way that could be our technology. He has since then even come out and said that he now works in the air defense industry and is aware of the most cutting edge technology as part of his role as a defense contractor. And he says, therefore, he's even more sure, even more certain that this couldn't possibly be our technology. We also hear people like Jeremy Corbell coming out and saying that David Fravor has told him that he was spoken to by the CIA. And basically what he's claiming there is the CIA was trying to pull a fast one on him and was trying to convince him that the Tic Tac was our technology. But it was seen as basically counterintelligence. It was seen as false information. So even as Ross is coming forward and saying, I know this is true categorically, you have people like Jeremy Corbell coming forward and saying, I've spoken to David Fravor recently. We know that the CIA has deliberately tried to deceive him before and sell this notion that it's actually our technology. So these seem mutually opposed claims, Nathan. So when you think about, again, the stack of players that we've talked about over time, Jeremy Corbell is one, David Fravor is one. What do you do in terms of making sense of those, what seem like contradictory claims?
Yeah, I think that's the question. I think too, we had David Grush, right? He also has been quoted to say that there's no way that could have been our technology. Kevin Day as well has been quoted as saying those too. But I have to look at it from the standpoint of what are the frameworks that these individuals bring to this assessment. And so if I look at it from that perspective, I can completely understand why they would all take that position that this couldn't possibly be Lockheed Martin technology, couldn't be ours. Why would they use it in that situation? It's just not something that they would do. And there's also kind of a little bit of an arrogance there that being in those positions that some of these people have, that they would know. They would know that that this would be some sort of contractor technology and they'd have an inside scoop on that. I think it's very possible that we have to challenge those assumptions. And I'm willing to, I think, still keep an open mind on what the Tic Tac truly is. It may frustrate some people who might want me to kind of weigh in on a specific side, one side or the other. But I think as we've hinted at, it's conceivable that it could be Lockheed technology, but also not exclusively so. So Lockheed technology in a partnership with some sort of other entity or being or whatever who's kind of helped them create that craft. Time will tell. I hope we will get some greater clarity on this going forward. But I think beyond the clarity of whether it's Lockheed Martin or whether it's NHI, I think we have to ask a bigger question, and that is, how important is it if we know one way or the other? How important is it to us that we have that high degree, 100% certainty that we know where the craft came from? What does that change for us? Does that really impact us in ways that are existential? Does it make you more frustrated? Examine your reaction to one of the other possibilities, and what is your kind of energetic response to that? I think that's an important thing to consider, and I would ask us to try to apply that assessment to any of the debates that we're having, right? So how important is winning the debate to you in this effort? Because right now, from where I sit in the summer of 2025, it feels like we're in the fog of war. When you're in the fog of war, there's a high degree of uncertainty. You don't know what's going on. You're in a fight. You feel like you're in a fight, but you don't know, where the damage is coming from, who's next to you, could be an enemy, could be a friend. Your situational awareness is at an all-time low. Your vision is obscured. And that's where I feel like we are. I feel like we've been given so many different conflicting points of information and sort of rabbits to chase that the community is just in shambles. Like we're kind of attacking each other. We're taking these hard positions. We're not able to think a little bit more fluidly about the situation, willing to suspend judgment for a little while. This is just not something that as a community we're particularly strong at doing. But I would encourage people to try to do that, to try that, even if you're hearing something as strongly stated as Ross stated it, categorically, this is Lockheed Martin technology. I think you still have to take a little bit of a 30,000 foot view and say, well, what does that really mean? And how true is that? And how important is it, if that is true, to my overall convictions and beliefs about what is truly happening here? It certainly raises a whole host of questions like we've covered. But I think for me, the larger questions are, what are the implications on how I live my life? What are my implications for the greater picture of what's taking place in our relationship with non-human intelligence? So that's my reaction. I know we want to talk a little bit about kind of the approach in general, but what about you, Darren? I mean, how do you feel about this claim, and do you feel like you are ready to take one position exclusively over the other?
Well, I think about it from a few different angles, and one of the angles I'm always aware of, and I think it's something we should always be considerate of and cognizant of, and that is that any movement is both potentially true and potentially false in another way, and being potentially used as a psyop as well. All of that can be happening simultaneously. And that one of the notions here is that the most convincing disinformation is that which has some elements of truth in it. So I think we do have to acknowledge, unlike many people are doing on social media, that both sides, both camps have valid points that are difficult to overcome. Because if it's true that we had this technology, and we even had it as early as 20 years ago, then you have to ask yourself, is that possible? Is it possible that a secret, not only involving an 80-year cover-up of UFOs crashing, could exist, but that we could have civilization transforming technology and have had it for decades and kept it all under wraps? Many people just find that a bridge too far. They just can't go there. And that lends them to this notion that it must be NHI tech. I think, though, the people who want to say it's NHI tech have to account for the fact that we had some elements of the U.S. military landing on the aircraft carrier almost immediately after and confiscating all the relevant data. That surely looks like what you might imagine as an actual exercise that was completely set up for exactly that. That you're going to surprise a certain element of your forces by another element, red team, blue team kind of thing. And in that, you also will quickly confiscate the data so you can analyze how the interaction happened. That is something we have to reckon with, right? So we have elements of the technology itself, which in its transformative nature lends itself to the argument that it must be NHI tech. But then you have the actual situational elements of what happened that day on the Nimitz that lend credibility to the notion that somehow some element of the military was involved and even potentially planning this. And we know that part of this gatekeeping campaign involves a very strict need to know. So is it possible that some elite element did know what was going on while the rest of the entire military did not? It's absolutely possible. We hear about that over and over again. And again, going back to what David Grush has said about accords, we also have to consider cooperatively operated craft, that notion that not only do we have recovered craft that have been reverse engineered successfully to some degree or another, but we may even have ongoing cooperation and communication with some of these NHI species. We, of course, think about some of the other implications from the lore. The fact that there are these deep underground bases in the American Southwest where hybrids are being created, where super soldiers are being created or at least experimented with as part of an implication of that hybrid program. We think back to Rachel's Eyes, which I did an episode of POC on, where there's apparently a portal kind of zone over a certain top secret base in the American Southwest where these craft come in, and that furthermore, sometimes there is a disturbance that happens in that process of rematerializing that leads sometimes to these crashes. And that, in fact, that story claims that one of these guys was responsible for going and picking up the craft so they could be reverse engineered and looked into, but also sometimes recovering alien beings, including a hybrid being, partly human, partly gray, that he then raises as his own daughter. And even part of the implication there is that she is introduced to the American college scene. And actually, apparently, I found out more recently at a college been just outside of Sacramento where I used to go walking often. So that was a funny synchronicity when I found out. So all these elements that some people, again, huge segments of our community, even I would say, that's too far. I'm not going to go into that woo territory. But ironically, these new elements that are emerging from perhaps our most mainstream journalists from within the community, being Ross Coulthart, suddenly connect those pieces. They create the potentiality to make sense of all these pieces, where we have not just craft that's NHI originally and then reverse engineered, but ongoing cooperation. And again, the degree, therefore, of distinction between reality as we understand it to be versus reality that actually is happening at a much deeper level with all of this, not just metaphysical implications, but these cross-species interactions. All this comes into play. Even the notion of the Fermi paradox, right? The notion that shouldn't we have seen more life out there by now? You start recognizing that our entire situation does feel like a managed reality. The question is, to what degree does some human element, human elite, know about this and are actually gaming it to some degree? Now, I also want to point out that I hold all of this quite comfortably, actually. I'm not overwhelmed by this because I have understood for a long time now that when you have a spectrum of consciousness development, you will have some groups that are not as far along in terms of returning to the sense of source and everything being connected, they will still act in self-serving ways. They're not evil per se, and that's why it's frustrating to both you and I only see people quickly leaping to what if these are demons, as if we have a clear understanding of what demons are, and it's a very absolute black and white kind of binary framing there. But if we have a spectrum of consciousness development, then this would happen both for humans and for non-humans. And furthermore, as we see attested to in material like the raw contact material, as well as some other material as well, including Dolores Cannon's material, that this is all allowed because free will is championed and respected and guarded because it's through trial and error that we learn these lessons, that these are not things you can just be cerebrally provided with and truly understand. You have to live through the experience of exercising your own free will and seeing how those actions impact others. Even wrapping up into, for instance, near-death experiences or people remembering past lives. And in those moments, not only do they remember everything that happened to them and how they felt, but they now can remember and feel how that felt to everyone else in every scene of every moment of their life. Because the whole point is that is how we learn, by understanding the implications of our actions and how we impact each other and how ultimately we're all part of the same thing, all reflections of the same ultimate mind. That is true, but it can also be incredibly messy. Consciousness development always is. These are the polarities we work with in this dimension. But the implications for not just what's happening geopolitically that we're not really aware of on the surface, but more importantly, the metaphysical implications and what's happening simultaneously, multidimensionally, I think for many people, that is still a bridge too far for many. What's your take on that kind of framing of this from the most overarching perspective?
I mean, I definitely agree. And I think we're in a period of time where we've not exercised an ability to get that clarity. We're in an attention economy. We're at, where the latest, greatest, shiniest thing is buying for our attention. And that's happening dozens and dozens of times every single day to everybody. And so we're pulled in many different directions, and some of our best instincts to kind of find community and find a tribe of people that we can share life with. That's a great instinct to have, but those instincts have been weaponized against the human family. And so we've been, kind of goaded into this hyper tribalism and distracted by all these different, shiny things. And we've chosen these factions and we want to be at war with each other. And that war is very busy and it gets in the way of us being able to discern and cut through that noise and that fog to getting greater clarity. So the question that I wrestle with is, are we going to get more clarity ahead, or are we going to be beset with just more confusion? And if we're going to get clarity, who's that going to come from? And I think we can talk a little bit about, as we come to the end of the show, what are our expectations for leadership in terms of getting clarity on this issue? Can we reasonably expect to get clarity from the political establishment? That if you just look around right now, regardless of the administration, you look around right now, it's pretty obvious to me you're not getting clarity about what's happening in the world. So I don't expect to get clarity from them. I'm not sure they have the ability to find it. I think they're plunged in the same murky waters that the rest of us are in. They're just as distracted as we are, and they're trying their best to keep their heads above the water. And it's very, very challenging to do that. And they're just trying to win the short-term political arguments they can win to win re-election. So are they the sources of wisdom? Are they the sources of clarity and vision? I really don't think so. So if they're not going to be the ones delivering this information to us, then where's it going to come from? Should we look outside of ourselves to find those answers, or should we try to find those answers inside? And I think what you've hinted at there about the greater metaphysical reality is that the internal battle in our minds that we all have experienced, that waging of ideas and conflicts, that battle spills out into the external world, the external experienced world. So the degree to which you can calm the inner world, that calmness, that clarity, it also spills out into the outer world. And I think we are just really bad at cultivating it, right? So when it comes to this specific issue, what is at stake? Which UFO is piloted by whom, and which craft is owned by which company? I don't know that matters to me as much as trying to find that clarity of the inner voice, because that makes all of this stuff, for me anyway, seem like a silly distraction. Doesn't mean there's not value to it. I think I want to get to the place where I have enough stillness of mind that I can evaluate these claims, these many different claims, and as you say, not necessarily clinging on to them and hold on to them too tightly, but evaluate them and keep them in a bit of a suspension. Because just like a dream state can be very, very rewarding, but also confusing and frightening and exciting, and it can have all of those things at one time. And all of those things can be true, right? It's not necessarily needing to fall on one thing or the other and say, I had a great dream, I had a bad dream. The dream encompassed all of these things. And to fail to recognize that complexity actually does a disservice to the reality. So that's the perspective that I'm trying to cultivate and take into this future-looking sort of phase. I do hope to get greater clarity, but I'm just not expecting it to come from outside.
Yeah, and I think it is helpful to take a multi-perspectival view. This is a term we've introduced a few times on this podcast, and we can be tracking for and responsive to things that are arising on different levels simultaneously. So like you, I certainly hope we get more clarity. I don't think we should give up on the fight for clarity. I think that we should endeavor to lobby for transparency from our lawmakers. And even if that seems like a stretch right now, I think that is a worthy cause to keep working towards. I think what this may do, if some of this does spill out, as it begins to spill out, is it will allow even some people that maybe traditionally have been quite trusting of our political systems. I think you and I would have been identified in that crowd previously. And one of the things that this journey does is it helps you understand that there is a bit of a ruse going on, that what things look like on the surface is not at all like what's going on at a deeper level. So as that comes out, I think we may ask deeper questions about how we should structure our government. How much have we been kind of asleep at the wheel as these things have been unfolding that might create a kind of citizen activism that we really need to emerge? Because one of the things that Ross pointed to is that he thinks part of the reason why, even as some Congress people are becoming more aware of what's really going on here and how deep and widespread it is, the reason why they're not eager to expose it or to take action against it is because in that process, they would have to expose basically how much their systems have failed in terms of representing the American people. And he basically compared it to 9/11, but 9/11 on steroids in terms of an intelligence failure. That this would mean that things that have been evidenced all along have been unaccounted for and not responded to. And that involves also the drone situation with China and potentially how they may have surpassed us even, not even just caught up to us, but also the implication of what Eisenhower warned us about in terms of the military-industrial complex perhaps becoming so powerful and so beholden to its sense of being able to not just play the game, but set the rules of the game, that when you think about this quote, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, that may be exactly what's happened here. And how do we begin to reel that in? How do we begin to respond when this technology might be in play that so eclipses what we're aware of and what we're operating with? So I think there are definitely big picture societal questions that emerge from this that will create a kind of deep analysis and introspection on a civilization scale like we've never seen before in our history as a human species. And that might produce some good things. But in the meantime, it might be a while before that happens, and we'll have to see how these elements unfold over the next months and years. But transcending all of that and the UFO community and the journey we've been on since 2017, I think we have to not mistake the fact that the real opportunity here is for us to ask individual questions of ourselves. What will we stand for? What do we want our lives to be about in light of the fact that we realize things are not as they appear, and that this is a metaphysical playground in many ways, that whether you come from a religious background or an atheist background, whether you are a progressive Democrat or a conservative Republican or an independent and somewhere in between, you recognize that things are much more complicated. This is a multidimensional stage. You yourself are a multidimensional being. The implications here are profound, not just for how we make sense of the world, but how now we choose to live. How shall we live tomorrow knowing these things are true? Because this is about so much more, of course, than acknowledging there are others in our midst and that we may have technologies that could transform our world. Because beyond that, the question is, who are we? What is the purpose of any life, any iteration, any incarnation? If it's about learning to work with the events of our lives as energetic configurations so that we ourselves can become wizards of energy, if you will, or we grow in our power to be able to wield and transform that energy, not just exterior like technologies that are transformative, but even internal, interior technologies, the inner science of this interior development, which begins with a real deep and cultivated awareness of yourself. So as we see these wars, if you will, happening on UFO Twitter, these different camps are established, I would ask people to be aware of their own reactionism, their own distortions, which are their greatest enemies. So rather than identifying enemies out there, instead be aware of your own field, be aware that you have access to this interconnected field. You can interrelate with it, and you can actually co-author as an agent of consciousness, which is, again, what this all kind of points towards. So don't miss the forest for the trees in this process, because that is, I think, the ultimate invitation. And many of the people that I'm in close association with, including yourself, are thinking about things in those terms, the implications in terms of future and intentional communities and how we will choose to live very carefully and take into consideration these most metaphysical matters is what's most important to us. And I think that is the true opportunity on the table. And to get caught up in any of these other elements, as overwhelming as they are, is to be caught up in the pyrotechnics.
I don't think I can say it any better. That's really great. It's an initiatory experience. And I'm reminded so often how many initiatory opportunities come across our paths every single day. how many times, going about your daily life that you are thrust into an opportunity to take one road or the other. And, think about the times where you've allowed yourself to become consumed by the distraction, or allowed yourself to be sucked into the argument, as opposed to the times where you've tried to hold that at arm's length and see that as an energetic expression of reality that is just taking place, all taking place in your experience. It's not something you have to identify with. It's just happening. Very easy to say, very hard to do, but it is something, like as you allude to, that gets easier with practice. And I think that as we move ahead, the months ahead for the remainder of 2025, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to practice. Conflicting sort of soundbite of a test of our allegiances and loyalties to the parties in the disclosure movement. I have no doubt there will be some exciting revelations at play, and I look forward to talking about them, exploring them. But ultimately, I'm deeply concerned, as you point out, about the ways in which we live and about our society, about the direction that we can go as a people that hopefully transcends some of the things that have gotten us in this mess to begin with. So time will tell. I'm optimistic. I'm a mental time traveler, so I'm going to pretend that it's all worked out, and we will see you on that other side. So on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery, and may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.